You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 31.
The days rolled by. Isabelle and her friends continued to live the good life in Shangri-La. There was no school and no parents. They went wherever they wanted and did whatever they liked. Culturally, Yeti teenagers enjoyed a lot of freedom in Shangri-La, and the three human teenagers were accorded the same benefits. All of their needs were provided for, and they had no responsibility. Every day they saw something that astonished them. It was like going on a permanent vacation to Disneyland. Their hosts never raised the topic of when they would be leaving, but Isabelle sensed that that time was not far away. With the exception of Burnmaster and Nicky Zipster, everybody that had been rescued from the avalanche on Yala Peak had recovered from their injuries. Flat Top had not recovered his memory yet, and he was a completely different person, which was a good thing, but other than that he was back to 100% health. That was, after all, the principal reason why they all had been allowed into the secret underground city, to heal. Once the healing was done, it was time to go. Isabelle was surprised that she, Laheeti and Twig had been allowed to stay this long. Their injuries had been minor and they had been up on their feet for 2 weeks now. She asked about it one day, and Abby explained that because they were under adult age, the Shangri-La Council was being extra cautious. This was the first time children had been rescued from the mountains, and the council wanted to make sure that Isabelle, Laheeti and Twig returned home in good health along with the adults. Isabelle was grateful. If not for the Yeti's help, right now she would be a blonde-haired ice block in that crevasse on Yala Peak. That said, she privately thought it was strange that the Yetis bothered to rescue needy people. Now that she had seen Shangri-La, seen how incredible it was and how amazing its citizens were, the idea that the Yetis would risk it all just to help a few humans didn't really add up. It just seemed like an enormous risk to Shangri-La for no payoff. If the roles were reversed and Isabelle was a Yeti, she probably wouldn't do it. That way, the secret of Shangri-La would always be safe. All it took was for one person to somehow sneak a photo out, and then the Yeti's extraordinary secret would be shot down in flames. Abby said that up to now, no human that had been rescued by the Yetis had betrayed them. In fact, there was a network of rescued, ever-grateful humans living in many countries around the world, secretly committed to helping the Yeti cause. But as far as Isabelle could see, all it took was one dodgy human, and the game would be up. So far so good, said Abby, but Isabelle knew that not everybody rescued by the Yetis would do the right thing. There was always one bad apple. It was just a matter of time. Isabelle started counting down the days until their departure on the afternoon that Burnmaster emerged from the hospital and walked confidently around the boulevard using only one crutch. He beamed at her, breathing in the air that was heavy with the rich scent of flowers. Isabelle circled him, put her hands on her hips, and declared it was a miracle. Now, all that remained was for Nicky Zipster to regain her mobility, and their stay in Shangri-La would be over. Judging from the amount of plaster still covering Nicky's limbs and the number of tubes coming out of her body, Isabelle figured it would be at least a month. She was totally fine with that. There was still so much to see and learn in Shangri-La, and it would probably be her only opportunity, ever. But a couple of days later in the hospital, a conversation with Nicky changed everything. Burnmaster, Isabelle and Twig were sitting in chairs arranged around the hospital bed. Twig had a hospital tray on his lap and was helping himself to a bowl of ice cream left over by Nicky. "I've decided not to leave," Nicky declared. Burnmaster looked at Nicky, not quite understanding what she meant, and the smile slowly faded from his tanned face. Nicky pushed herself up in the bed, wincing slightly as she did so. The severity of her injuries had passed, and though she was still in some pain, she knew that in the coming months she would return to normal health. Her daily dose of painkillers was down to almost zero, and recently her mind had been very clear. She had given this a lot of thought over the last few days and talked about it with a representative of the Shangri-La Council. Now that she was telling Tom, she felt sure that she had made the right decision. But it had not been an easy one to make. His expression of shock was exactly what she expected to see. Isabelle looked just as surprised. "You mean you're going to stay here forever?" she blurted out. Nicky nodded. "I know it sounds completely mad, but I've thought about it quite a bit and talked to the right Yetis here," she replied. "They say I can stay if I want to. But doesn't it mean you have to renounce your life in the world?" asked Isabelle. "Yes," Nicky replied. "That's how it has to be done to protect this place. A person either lives here and makes a pledge of allegiance to Shangri-La, or they live in the world." Burnmaster was having trouble wrapping his head around her decision. But your friends, your whole life in England, he said, that's a lot to give up. I know, Nikki replied. She blinked, her eyes shiny. My parents passed away years ago, but all of my friends, her voice briefly faded away. I'll try and make them understand, but it won't be easy. Burnmaster blinked slowly and said, You can't tell them where you are or what's going on, right? She looked down and nodded. That's how it works, she replied quietly. And the same thing for old flames, Burnmaster continued. You're cut off from them as well. Her eyes met his. Shangri-La might make an exception for the ones that already know the secret, she laughed. Burnmaster leaned forward in his chair and stared idly at his own hands. And you're sure this is the right choice? He asked. Yes, she replied, wiping the tears from her cheeks. This place is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I've only been here a few weeks, but I can't imagine leaving it. All my adult life I've traveled around the world, stayed in many places, but never settled down. She looked at him with large eyes and added, and I've never married. Never really found what I wanted, but now I have. He shook his head in amazement. The letter she had sent to him containing the yeti tooth had seemed like the beginning of something big, something wonderful in his life. It heralded more than just an adventure in Nepal. Then he found out that she never sent that letter, never discovered the yeti tooth. He convinced himself that it didn't matter because that letter, wherever it came from, brought them together. But now she had made a decision that would send their lives down very different paths. Forever, he smiled ruefully and mused, this trip has been full of surprises, but his voice trailed off. Nothing like this, she said with a laugh. Right, he replied. She was quiet for a moment, then said, Maybe you can come and visit sometimes. Maybe, he replied, but even if he could, it wouldn't be the same. That evening, Burnmaster decided to stay in, and he let it be known, by his brooding demeanor, that he did not want any company. Isabelle was surprised at how much Nikki's decision had affected him. She considered talking to him about it, but Gulbenkian dissuaded her. I think he's heartbroken, the big man stammered. You should just leave him be, he'll get over it after a while. She reluctantly agreed, and as the lights of the underground city dimmed to twilight, she tagged along with the rest of the group, who were going to see one of Shangri-La's most beautiful nighttime wonders, the fireflies of the rainforest park. Aside from Burnmaster, Flattop was also absent. Isabelle asked Mohawk and Mane if anything was wrong. He's just tired, I think, replied Mohawk. His memory still hasn't returned, and relearning everything from scratch takes energy. Isabelle accepted this with a nod and gave it little more thought. As the group moved through the darkened streets, she noticed that Mane looked increasingly nervous. Sweat poured off his forehead, and he mopped at it with the sleeve of his blue toga. He refused to talk and instead focused on shining his torchlight into any shadows that they walked past. As the group entered the artificial rainforest and the last of the street lights faded into the darkness behind them, he looked more and more spooked. Isabelle tapped him on the arm and he almost jumped into the air. When we get to the fireflies, it won't be so dark anymore, she said helpfully. They'd better be like friggin' light bulbs with wings, he muttered, but his voice was not unfriendly. Isabelle joined Laheeti and Twig at the front of the group and told them about Nikki's decision to stay. Like her, they quickly realized that that meant their time in Shangri-La was almost up. They put it to Pemba, who said he wasn't privy to such information from the Shangri-La Council, but they were probably right. Soon they came to a clearing and stared up in wonder at the countless tiny lights buzzing around in the dark sky. There were millions of them, little pinpricks of yellow light drifting past, casting a soft glow on the visitors' upturned faces. Isabelle exchanged smiles with Laheeti and Twig. She gently held up one hand, but the little lights were too shy to land on her palm, instead floating away on the gentlest of breezes. With some encouragement, Mane switched off his torch, and the group stood quietly in the darkness, feeling themselves become part of the rainforest and the vibrant life within it. It was hard to believe that this place was unseen by the sun or the moon or the stars. Isabelle watched a cluster of fireflies swirl slowly past. This was nature at its most beautiful. In this underground cave, hidden away from the sky above the Himalayas, they were the stars of the night. Do these fireflies exist in other parts of the world? Asked Isabelle. Zosh shrugged. Dunno, they might be extinct, he replied. They've always been here, though, for as long as Shangri-La has been here. Mohawk and Mane gazed up at the sky in wide-eyed amazement. Isabelle watched them and realized it wasn't the first time she had seen such childlike expressions on their faces. Everything they did seemed to be a totally new experience for them. This evening was no exception. Everybody was affected by the spectacle, but for Mohawk and Mane, it looked like a totally mind-blowing experience. In the twilight of the rainforest, they stood in slack-jawed wonder, like cherub-faced gargoyles, mesmerized by the constellations of light floating above their heads. Isabelle thought about it for a while and decided she was misreading the situation. After all, they were all standing in the middle of a cave in an underground city populated by a hitherto undiscovered race of hominids, and the little critters in the sky were very beautiful. It made sense that Mohawk and Mane were awed by the experience. Even Zaw had grown quiet, seemingly touched by the light show. Eventually, one by one they turned and started back along the dirt path, walking in single file, pushing back the green foliage as they moved. Isabelle heard Mohawk's heavy boots behind her, each of his giant steps the same length as two of hers. She looked back. "You want to go first?" she asked. Mohawk shone his torch at her and shook his head. "I'm in no hurry to leave," he replied. "I'll probably never get to see anything like this again, may as well take our time." "We haven't got much time left," Isabelle stated. "We're probably going to have to leave soon, leave Shangri-La, I mean." "I know, I heard you talking to Laheeti and Twig," Mohawk said. "This rainforest is probably one of the last things we'll see here. I wish I could have taken a picture to help me remember it." Isabelle stopped and looked up at the silver-haired giant. "I think you'll remember it, the important parts anyway," she remarked. "And you'll remember the feeling." Mohawk frowned and asked, "What do you mean, the feeling?" "You know, the feeling," she explained. Wonder, excitement, the sense that you're alive, that you've discovered something new and amazing. That feeling will stay with you forever, even after the picture in your mind gets a little blurry." The GX thought about it for a long moment. Feelings were something that the North Korean military had specifically trained him to repress. Friendship, mercy, fear, even love, for a soldier they were a liability. At best they slowed you down, at worst they got you killed. Except for hate, he and his brothers had been given a masterclass in that one. He grinned. With the torchlight shining up from beneath his face, Isabelle thought he looked like a demon with a punk rock hairstyle. "I like that," he replied. "I think I will remember the feeling." She nodded, then turned and continued along the path, soon catching up with Zaw, who was at the front of the group with Pemba and Twig. They passed by a stream and then down a concrete pathway that led back to the lights at the outskirts of the city. Once on the boulevard, Isabelle had a pretty good idea how to get back to the middle of the city. From there, she could find Zaw's house. In the few weeks that she had been in Shangri-La, she had gotten to know the city pretty well. It was too bad she would never see it again. The streets were quiet and deserted, the shop fronts dark. Isabelle followed Zaw around a street corner, and as she did so, she looked across the street at a large, brightly lit window. Inside, she saw yetis in colorful togas sitting at desks. "Check out that place," she said, pointing. "Looks like an internet cafe." "That's because it is an internet cafe," remarked Zaw. Isabelle grabbed the teenage yeti by the shoulder and spun him around. "Do you mean you've got the internet here?" she exclaimed excitedly. Zaw shrugged. "Why wouldn't we?" he grunted. "We've got everything else." "Why didn't you say so sooner?" Isabelle asked. "I didn't know it was such a big deal," Zaw muttered. Isabelle had been experiencing some severe internet withdrawal for the past week. Astonished, she stammered, "Can we use it?" Zaw glanced around the empty street. "Do you see me or anybody else trying to stop you?" he asked. Isabelle hurried across the street, followed by Twig, Laheeti and Gull, then Mohawk and Mane. Zaw sauntered after them, shaking his head and grinning, thinking that he probably should have told them earlier. He had intended to tell them the day they were leaving Shangri-La, just to see the disbelieving expressions on their faces, but Isabelle had beaten him to it. When he arrived at the internet cafe, he found them all standing uncertainly, just inside the entrance. Isabelle was looking around, confused. There were about 10 toga-wearing teenage yetis in the room, sitting at desks and talking silently at large computer monitors. Isabelle watched their mouths move soundlessly. It was like everybody in the room was on mute. The images on the computer monitors were three-dimensional, their design completely unfamiliar. "These aren't like the computers we have back home," she said. "We've made a few improvements," replied Zaw. "These ones are a bit more advanced than yours." Isabelle watched the users talking silently. "What do you do?" she queried. "Mouth words at it and it reads your mind," Zaw laughed. "Not quite that advanced," he replied. "You just talk and the computer will understand. You can't hear what they're saying because there's kind of a force field around them that cuts out the sound. Otherwise, the room would be filled with a babble of everybody talking and it would be impossible to concentrate." Twig nodded. "How do you get the internet connection up here in the Himalayas?" he asked. "You mean because we're so far away?" Zaw said. Twig nodded and replied, "Yeah." Zaw thought about it for a moment. "Not really sure," he said. "You never asked anybody?" Twig queried. No, Zaw said flatly. Why? Twig raised his eyebrows. Just figured you might know, he muttered. Zaw crossed his arms and said, You flew to Nepal on a jumbo jet, right? Twig nodded and answered, Right. I've never been on one, but I bet jumbo jets weigh a lot, Zaw said. How do the engines get the plane off the ground? Well, they're jet engines, Twig explained. The fuel goes in and it comes out as thrust. Yeah, but how do the engines actually produce enough power to get the plane all the way from Vavu to Nepal? Zaw asked. Twig shuffled his feet. Well, I don't exactly know, he conceded. Zaw winked at him. Bingo, he replied with a smirk, but it still works, don't it? Isabelle sat down in front of a monitor and looked for the ON switch. Zaw rolled his eyes, tapped her on the shoulder, and made a chatterbox motion with one hand, indicating she should talk to the computer. She faced the screen and, feeling slightly foolish, said, Computer, switch on, please. The monitor immediately filled with color and an image of the Windows icon swimming across the screen in 3 dimensions. In the ceiling above her head, a fluorescent blue ring lit up, emitting some kind of force field, to use Zaw's terminology, and immediately eliminating the sound of her friends talking behind her. She told the computer that she wanted to use email, and the Windows icon was immediately replaced with the standard login screen. She looked around nervously, wondering who would overhear her say her password, and then remembered that she was, in effect, sitting in a cone of silence. By the time she had accessed her email account, she felt entirely at ease giving the computer spoken instructions. She stuck her head outside the boundaries of the blue ring and asked Zaw, Surely you don't want me to email my friends and tell them where I am and what I'm doing? Zaw shrugged. I told you nobody cares, he said. If you do, your friends will probably never believe you. But what if they do believe me and my email goes viral? Isabelle pressed. Then it will be just another Yeti hoax on the internet, Zaw stated. There's heaps of them there already, nobody takes that stuff seriously. The others found empty computer consoles, sat down and started talking to their computers. They clearly had a long list of people they wanted to contact and were in a hurry to do so. By contrast, Mohawk and Maine were the last to sit down. Their chairs creaked in protest as the 2 giant GXs eased their colossal bodies onto them. Given that Maine had decided to abandon his life in the North Korean military, he considered sending his masters a final farewell message, but there wasn't much to say. There was certainly no way he would tell them about Shangri-La. If the North Koreans sent 3 commandos to find one measly little Yeti tooth, there was no telling what they would do if they found out there was an entire city of Yetis holed up in the mountains. It was possible that the Grand Marshal would send a whole division of soldiers to find Shangri-La and hunt down a Yeti. It didn't bear thinking about. No, Maine thought there would be no final letter to his former masters. It was better that way. The less they knew about what had become of he and his brothers, the better. It was a clean break and a new beginning. Maine liked that, but he wasn't ready to forget about everything he had seen and heard during his military training. There was something that had been on his mind for a while, something he overheard the Grand Marshal say to the North Korean scientists just before he and his brothers were given their mission orders to come to Nepal. At the time he heard it, he didn't understand what it meant. He and his brothers were trained to follow orders, not think, not solve problems. The Grand Marshal's words were unfamiliar. The soldier within Maine told him that what he hadn't been taught he didn't need to know. But that mindset was part of the old Maine, part of the commando trained to kill first and ask questions later. Things were different now, and he had a feeling that the Grand Marshal's words were important. He had a feeling that discovering their meaning might lead to an important discovery about himself. Maine remembered the moment very clearly. After presenting themselves to the Grand Marshal, an individual they had been taught to worship as a god, he and his brothers had failed to impress. They weren't good enough, he said. A super soldier that was afraid of the dark, or heights, or small spaces, pathetic. If this ever got out, the North Korean military would be the laughingstock of its enemies. And then the Grand Marshal had said, once we have created a few successful batches of Yeti Cross test subjects, we can liquidate the GXs and direct all of our resources to creating the next generation of super soldier. Maine took a deep breath and played the moment back in his mind again. We can liquidate the GXs, the silver-haired giant wondered what it meant. He knew that their masters in North Korea always referred to them as the GXs. Mohawk was GX1, he was GX2, and Flat Top was GX3, but what did GX mean? What did liquidate them mean? And what was a successful batch of Yeti Cross test subjects? These were questions that had been on Maine's mind since coming to Nepal, and now, seated in front of a computer with access to the internet, he could start to look for answers. He asked the computer to search the web for the words Yeti Cross. There was a lot of information about yetis, and he was amused to see that the vast majority of it was completely off the mark. The stories were mostly about mysterious footprints in the snow and blurry pictures taken by adventurers in remote places. He glanced at those websites and moved on. He was more interested in what Yeti cross might mean, but after looking at dozens of sites he couldn't find anything on point. He did find information about crossbreeding animals, such as dogs, to produce more desirable physical and behavioral traits, a practice that was apparently done all over the world. Could Yeti cross be a reference to crossbreeding yetis? Mayne thought about it for a while and decided it didn't make any sense. He couldn't see how his masters could hope to crossbreed a yeti using just one little yeti tooth, for that was what he and his brothers had been sent to Nepal to obtain. Surely they needed at least a whole yeti to make it work. Stumped, he turned his attention to what GX meant. His search returned lots of information, but none of it was relevant. After a while he hit upon the idea that the X might be a shorthand way of saying cross, so possibly GX meant G-cross. That tied in nicely with the words Yeti cross, except for the problem that Mayne had no idea what the G stood for. Whatever the answer was, he had a feeling that it would lead to many more answers about who he and his brothers really were. Mohawk tapped Mayne on the shoulder and shrugged his huge shoulders, as if to ask. Found anything? Mayne shook his head, then turned back to the computer. There was one more word he wanted to look up before finishing. After finding a website that had a North Korean dictionary on it, he told the computer to find the meaning of liquidate. The computer returned a paragraph of information explaining that the word had several different meanings. The GXs had been trained to kill but not to read, and as a result, Mayne had to work his way slowly from the first word in the paragraph to the last. The first and second meanings related to paying debts or converting things into cash. The idea that the Grand Marshal intended to sell he and his brothers after creating a batch of Yeti cross test subjects, whatever that meant, didn't feel right. He and his brothers were people, not property, and who would they be sold to? Moving on to the third meaning, he mouthed the words out carefully. 3. To abolish or do away with. A cold shiver ran down Mayne's spine when he understood the meaning. Throwing away he and his brothers was entirely in character for his masters in North Korea. The real question was what would have happened to them after they were thrown away. Would they be stripped of their rank as commandos and sent to the regular army, or worse, made to peel potatoes and clean toilets? The thought of leaving the beauty and freedom of the Himalayas and being locked away in a dark North Korean army kitchen made him feel sick. He turned his attention to the fourth meaning and read it slowly. The words were chilling in their simplicity. They impacted inside his brain like a sledgehammer. 4. To get rid of, particularly by violent means. Since coming to Nepal, Mayne had felt a wonderful sense of peace and tranquility enter his soul. The sweetness of the mountains had been a cure to the violence and hate he had been taught to eat, sleep, and breathe during his military training. But that inner serenity was swept away by the red-hot hate that now filled his veins. The idea that his masters had planned to kill him was almost beyond comprehension, the feeling of betrayal like a knife in his heart. Until now, he had believed that he was the betrayer, for it was he who had turned his back on North Korea, choosing instead a life of peace and freedom. Some small part of him felt bad about that, but no more, because now he understood that his trusted masters had planned the ultimate betrayal to murder he and his brothers when they returned home. When his rage had cooled to manageable levels, he began to think more clearly. His master's evil, he decided, was par for the course. They had taught him to succeed at any cost, to do whatever it took to achieve the mission objective. It made sense that they played by the same rules. After all, the best leaders led by example. The Grand Marshal's ultimate objective was to take over the world, and nothing would stand in his way. Every soldier in the military was expendable, the GXs were no exception. It wasn't personal. When your usefulness was up, you became surplus to requirements. Mayne's anger gave way to a warm feeling of elation. Whatever his masters had planned for him wasn't going to happen now, because he knew, and he was free. North Korea was dead to him. His master's orders were meaningless. From now on, he would choose his own path in life, do what he wanted to do, and decide for himself what was right and what was wrong. The giant GX with the silver mane of hair began to relax, and his thoughts turned to more philosophical questions. What did his masters want with a Yeti tooth? Clearly the tooth was important. That was why the Grand Marshal personally came to see he and his brothers prior to the mission. It was hard to see how one tooth could aid the North Korean military regime. Surely the Grand Marshal wasn't just a collector of rare incisors. There had to be another reason, no doubt linked to what the Grand Marshal called the Yeti cross test subjects. Maine thought about it for a while but couldn't see the connection. The problem was that his rudimentary military education didn't include even one class in the biological sciences. He had no idea that a yeti's DNA could be extracted from its tooth and used by scientists to recreate the creature, or a hybrid of it. Just like he had no idea that that process had already been perfected while creating him, and that he was, genetically speaking, half gorilla. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Isabelle standing next to him. "Are you and Mohawk done?" she asked. Maine instructed the computer to return to the home page. The information on the screen disappeared. He looked back at the blonde-haired girl. "Yeah, we're done," he said. The odd group of yetis and humans left the internet cafe and made their way back to downtown Shangri-La. When they were a few minutes away from their houses, Abby pulled Isabelle aside and asked if she wanted to turn in yet. Isabelle shook her head. It was possibly her last night in Shangri-La, and she didn't want to go to sleep. As the others said goodnight and went inside, the two teenage girls hung back until they were the only ones standing on the quiet street. Pemba noticed what was going on and smiled to himself. The two girls had become good friends over the past few weeks, and when Isabelle returned home, it was likely that they would never see each other ever again. Aside from the fact that London was a very long way from the Himalayas, Shangri-La was not a summer vacation spot, and the council probably wouldn't allow Isabelle or her friends to come and go as they pleased. It was a policy to ensure Shangri-La's security, but it meant splitting up good friends. Pemba was glad the two girls had found time to hang out for a bit longer and say their goodbyes. From his bedroom window, he watched them continue up the street, Abby in the red toga and Isabelle in the yellow, and wondered where they were going.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.